Hi, welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. I see some attendees joining. If you could do me a favor and in the question or chat box, write where you're from, just so I can see that we have an audience with us. All right, we have Houston and Maryland. That's a good start, Pete. And Maryland has the majority so far. Pennsylvania, welcome, Todd. Well, we'll get started right on time and the stragglers will have to catch up. So thanks for joining us today for our eWSJF webinar. I'm Audrey and I'll be monitoring your questions on the sidebar. So throughout, go ahead and add your questions down in the chat. Welcome, Bradley from Bethesda, Maryland. You will receive an email with a link to the recording and information on claiming your continuing education credits like PDUs and SEUs after we finish. If you want to download the slide deck, it is in the handout section. I'll also send out a link to that after the presentation is over, so you'll get that in your inbox. And our presenter, Pete Oliver Kruger, is a Lean Agile expert speaker, management consultant, and trainer specializing in the psychology of product development. His research over the past couple of decades has focused on scientifically proven techniques grounded in positive psychology, collaborative growth, and cross-cultural exploration. On our webinar today, he'll help us explore prioritization through emotional weighted shortest job first, or eWSJF. Good morning, Pete.
Good morning, Audrey. Thank you so much for the introduction. And welcome everybody to this presentation on the eWSJF. If you have heard of WSJF before, you may notice that there's an E in front of it. We'll talk about why that is there. If you haven't heard about what WSJF is, I will give you the full name for it and all the other details to go with it as well. I've got a bunch of different sections here. Let me make sure I click the button in the right place. We're going to talk about a couple things in the background just so that everybody has the same context about what we're talking about. And then we'll get to the specific eWSJF down there, sort of towards the end of this. At the end of each section, I'll also take a quick pause in case anybody has questions about any of the background information, just to make sure that we all are able to move forward at the same pace. Just, I guess, a little bit about me. So you got the picture of me up there on the side. As Audrey was saying, I've been doing product development and agile management and consulting for a while now. And sort of got my start way back when with the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Got to work on the first accredited online university. If you live in the DC or Maryland area and if you've ever taken the Metro, then you've actually probably used the trip planner. I built the first one of those and also worked as an architect for quite a while. So there's quite a bit of software in the government and around the area that's built off of the stuff that I've been able to put together. But one of the things that I always found was that the architecture didn't matter so much if there wasn't a context of that sort of reason why we're building this product, and building the right products and building the products for the right people. So that became the sort of the focus of what I began doing in the latter part of my career and what I go around helping other people with. And so in that consulting, we've sort of found that that's not the only place where it's good to sort of like call out and focus. We've identified really 7 large, what we call sparks, business agility sparks, that are great focus points when you are looking to transform your organization and get into agility. We're going to focus on mainly the portfolio Kanban section, which is up there into the top left. And we're also going to talk a little bit about sort of the Agile Value Management Office. But I wanted to talk about those 2 first to give sort of a context of where we've been, sort of the experience that we've had with organizations, and the reason that we've kind of selected these as sort of sparks to get people ready with their transformations. So the first one I want to talk about is this idea of the Agile Value Management Office. So value is what we're sort of driving towards now and moving away from this conversation of what we used to do on projects. And I still walk into organizations and they're working on agile projects, or agile products. They've actually kind of given up on projects in general, and they sort of have this thing, but they still seem to have a project management office. But we want to sort of get to that point where people are really starting to think all the way up and down about value management and value delivery. Because if we can't deliver value out to the customers, to the citizens, if you work in the government, or any of the people who are using the stuff that we build, then it doesn't matter how good we are and how much we build if we're missing that last step of delivering it actually out to our customers. So I'm not going to go into detail about what a value management office is, but just want to say that this is sort of the equivalent of what we used to do with the project management office. They connect in with the teams, they connect in with the steering groups, and they're really sort of looking at how can we promote value within the organizations. And one of the ways to do that is to look at how are we deciding what to work on next within our teams. And a great way to do that is with a portfolio Kanban. So if you think of the portfolio of the way we used to track projects, then that's kind of a similar kind of thing. Now it switches over to maybe looking at products, but we may have product teams. Now the question becomes, there's so many different things that we could build within a product team, and so many features that we could add to that product. And how do we choose which one should come next? And so the portfolio Kanban gives us sort of a model for doing this. Start with certain themes that the executives have that they would like to achieve. That gets broken down into certain ideas and theories on which one of those ideas are going to do best in the marketplace, which ones are going to deliver the best. That goes through a series of analysis. Maybe there's market analysis, customer analysis, team analysis, all sorts of different decision points that go into this. When something sort of works its way and figures out that this is really a good thing that we should put some focus on, then we want to put some funding through it and actually assign it into one of the product streams to actually start working on it with the teams. So that's sort of the general flow for the portfolio Kanban. Now, one of the things that I run into is people up at that executive level, at the director level, who are sort of dealing with those VMO concepts. They're constantly being hit with this question of, before we devote our resources to working on this project, how do we know that this is the right project to work on? And this challenge of, are you spending the right amount of time on the right thing? And so the portfolio Kanban allows a way to bring all those possibilities in and evaluate them side by side. And then the eWSJF fits in together with that as the method of comparing one possible feature against another possible feature. All right. Now, before we jump into weighted shortest job first, which is our next background topic, and take a quick pause and see if there's anybody that has any questions so far about value management offices.
We do. So Priyanka is asking, is finding value similar to finding MVPs for the project?
Yes and no. The classic consultant answer. So the MVP is a sort of a short-term way to take a particular hypothesis that we will deliver value and deliver a small segmented version of this out into the marketplace, get people actually using it to then see if we were right, that if we give this to them, then that they will have value. So in value, we're really kind of looking at, should we jump back one slide here? We're really looking kind of at the KPIs, the key performance indicators, and the metrics. So when we talk about value or measuring value, we want to sort of look at, for some places it might be, what percentage of the market do we have? For some places it might be like a net promoter score. Would people recommend us to other people? And for other places it may be that we want to see a certain number of conversions from people who visit our site once to people who come back on a regular cadence and work with us multiple times and repeat customers. And so each one of those is sort of a measurement of value. And MVP is a vehicle, a short time box experiment to see if we can deliver value with a particular feature. Does that help?
I think that's good, and that's our only question for now.
All right. So looking at weighted shortest job first. So this is what WSJF stands for. Some people also call it WSJF. And it's based on this kind of concept that if you're trying to decide between two things to build, and you have two things and they both will take the same amount of time, but you can get 4 times as much value from one versus the other, then go ahead and build the thing that's more valuable first. And likewise, if you have two things that each would deliver the same value, but you can build one in half the time, then go ahead and build the shortest project first. And so when you put these two together, then what we're looking at is building something that is the shortest valuable product that we could roll out to the marketplace. So that's a weighted shortest job first. Now, how do we define that value? How do we collect some information on it? So one of the ways that we can do that is we can look at user business value. And so this is sort of a classic way of measuring something. So how does this fit into the marketplace? It's the same things I was talking about in that sort of contrast between MVPs and value. But these are sort of the classic things that business folks look at to evaluate whether or not this is worth putting some time into. But there's been other things that people have found that are good parameters to think of, especially when you're sort of getting into sort of the metrics side of things. And one of those other factors is time criticality. Time criticality kind of has to do with, is it important that we do this now, or does it not matter? For example, is this regarding a legal matter, in which case, the CEO may actually go to prison in a month if we are not compliant? Then that is something that has a really high time criticality and something that we should deliver right now. But if it doesn't make a difference whether we do it now or we do it 2 years from now, then that has a really low time criticality. Or similarly, it could be that there's nobody else out in the marketplace that has the ability to do this or could do this. And so we don't really have a time criticality as far as our competitors or a risk with our competitors. But if there is somebody out there who is disrupting the field, somebody out there who is just about ready to launch a similar functionality, and you could potentially lose customers to those people, then that increases the time criticality of this initiative and whether or not we should tackle this and do this sooner. The third one to think about is sort of operational value. So these are the things that enable other things to happen. So these are your sort of architectural things, the back end. Should we install more servers? So if we have a case where we're going to launch something that's going to bring more traffic, the extra traffic might actually bring the servers down. We want to be able to launch something ahead of time that is going to increase our infrastructure, allow us to handle more traffic, that sort of gets us ready and reduces our risk for tackling other projects. And so these are some of the core sort of categories that operational time and business value that we can sort of factor into a calculation. Other people do a variety of other different things where they sort of break it down into subcategories of these things, but most of them tend to fall into one of these three categories. So we're just going to stick with these for right now. And there's this great equation for WSJF that pulls all of these things together and sort of gives us a way to compare these together, add some calculation between them. And it also starts to bring in the shortest aspect of things. So job size. So if we take those three values and we assign them a number, and we'll talk about how we pick the number for those. But if we give them a number and add them together, now we're looking at sort of a 3-part score that shows the value for this thing. And then we'll divide it by how long it's going to take to actually get it implemented, and that's what we call the job size. And so this gives us a inverse relationship. So the larger a job is, the less valuable it becomes over time. And the smaller the job is, then the higher it goes. And that matches what we were looking for before. So your WSJF score equals the value for your business, time criticality, and operational value divided by your job size. And if anybody's looked at any like the scaled agile frameworks, you probably have seen this equation already. They're making really great use of this in promoting portfolio Kanbans and the evaluations of it. So here's an example of a WSJF spreadsheet. The Agile VMO would go in and sit down. They would grab a bunch of different things. In this case, it's different features that we could build for our product. And they would build a list here on the left-hand side. And then they would go over to the right-hand side, and they would start to put in values for these things. So in user business value, we will start with, so we tend to use the Fibonacci sequence. This and very similar to how we would do story points on an Agile team. So it's Fibonacci, if you're not familiar with that, it starts basically each of the previous two numbers then added to the next number. So it starts with 1 and 2. Then if you do 1 plus 2 equals 3, and then 2 plus 3 equals 5, and 3 plus 5 equals 8, 5 plus 8 equals 13. So typically you'll see numbers that go from like 1, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. And the point is that when things are really small, you can see the variability between them a lot more efficiently than when they're large. So we can look at things and say, yeah, this is a difference between like a 1, a 2, a 3. But once we get to sort of a 5, it's kind of fuzzy. So we don't really care if it's a 4 or a 6, but it's a little bit larger. And so we say it's about twice as large. And then likewise, when we go from 5 to 8, we give ourselves a little bit more of a flex in there. And then 8 to 13 and 21. Each one of those things gives us a wider range of variability, a wider range of sort of a fudge factor in there, because the longer it gets or the higher it gets, the more likely that we're not precise in our estimates. So the numbers that you see in these columns here on those first three, user business value, time criticality, and operational value, are Fibonacci numbers. And so typically what we do is we'll sit down and go a column at a time. So we'll look at a bunch of different initiatives that we want to tackle. And then we'll sit down with like a bunch of executives in the room, maybe some product managers, and sort of have a conversation with multiple different people, same way we would in planning poker. And we start with saying, what is the thing on here that we think gives us the least amount of business value? And so we can say, all right, well, commenting for this group, they decided that that is the least amount of business value for them. So they're going to assign that a value of 1. And then we look at everything else and say, all right, so what would be twice as valuable? So book list sorting might be 2 to 3 times more valuable. Profile management would be like maybe 5 times more valuable. Book browsing for this bookstore would be 8 times as valuable. And so we sort of lay out those proportions on that. Now, we do this as a group because there's going to be a difference of opinion between folks. And usually the differences of opinion leads to really good conversations. And out of those conversations, we actually get a lot better at giving us a more accurate number. But we still acknowledge that each of these things are estimates. So we do the same thing for time criticality. And we can see that there's, there can be a huge, big discrepancy here. So in this example, book list sorting was the thing that we knew we were going to, want to have right out of the gate. That was going to be a driving sort of feature for that. Whereas the book browsing details was something that we figured that we can give more details, later as far as churning out some MVPs. So that was sort of what went into some of the decisions here on the numbers for time criticality. And then operational value was really looking at these some other different numbers on these things. And still looking at the operational value of commenting didn't really make very much difference, but profile management, while that can be useful for the user business value, really book browsing, as you can see, has more value across the board than profile management. But if we don't have profiles, we of course can't run the application. So the profile management is an enabler for other things to happen. So that gets a really high value when it comes to operational value. Now, there's several different ways that people do job size. I have found that when I'm working with teams, one of the fastest ways, especially when you're dealing with really large projects, is just to count the number of sprints that you think it's going to take. It becomes a really fast sort of metric, and it gives really pretty accurate scores. And then this last column over here is the calculation that we saw previously. So if we took user business value 5 plus time criticality 5 plus operational value of 8, total together for 18, and divided by the number of sprints, we end up with a 9. And so we've done that for each of the rows over here. And so now based on this, it tells us that what we should probably work on first is book browsing. After book browsing, since it got a 10.5, we can choose between doing profile management or book list sorting. So probably we're going to end up picking profile management because it's going to enable a bunch of other things. So we'll build that second. Then we'll build book list sorting third, and then we'll add commenting as our fourth feature at the end. All right. And take a pause. Any questions on weighted shortest job first?
We do have a couple of questions. One is, when is the WSJF spreadsheet worked on? At what point in the project?
It is worked on before the project even happens. So oftentimes when the executives are getting together to decide what the team should work on for the next, sometimes teams do it every quarter, sometimes teams do it every, every half year, so kind of semi-annually, would be a good time to sort of get together and evaluate what happens next. Now, I do have some teams that really love this process, and so they'll actually do it on a monthly basis to look at each of their initiatives inside of this, but generally you see it on the quarterly or the half-year basis.
All right, the follow-up to that was, who's in that meeting?
Typically, you're going to have product managers. So those are the people who are responsible for seeing that a product actually exists and lands within the marketplace. And you will also have executives in there, depending on the size of your organization. Some small organizations will even have the CEO in there, and chief financial officer, and a bunch of other folks. We're looking at a variety of different perspectives in there. Maybe a chief marketing officer, sales director, all of these places where you've got valuable insights as to what would be a good impact on the market. Anybody who can really give good input to that conversation.
All right, and a couple of questions about job size. Is job size here the same as MVP size?
Yes. Yes. When I use MVPs with teams, I'll have them look and say, all right, so we could rule out profile management, but what is our MVP version of profile management? And so then we would change this row and we would have profile management MVP 1, profile management MVP 2, profile management MVP 3, and then we would score each of those with their own number of sprints. So if we think we can get MVP number 1 of profile management out in a sprint or less, then we'll give that a 1, and then maybe version 2 might take us 2 sprints and we'll give that a 2.
All right, and the last one, can you use t-shirt sizes instead of number of sprints?
Well, at some point you're going to have to convert it back to a number. So that's why I've generally done that. Now, other places, and actually the original WSJF also used Fibonacci sequence. So they would do the same thing. Now, if you wanted to use t-shirt sizes for small, medium, large, and then have a number system that you translate that to, whether it be like 1, 5, 13, or 1, 3, 5, or whatever that relative value is, because it's a calculation, it just has to eventually be converted back to a number.
All right, let's roll.
All right. Okay, so now I want to talk about another topic, which is going to seem like a non sequitur, but I promise it comes back in. There's a gentleman, Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. If you haven't read this book, it is really valuable. He actually won the Nobel Prize in Economics for the work that he did, the research leading up to this book. And one of his discoveries was that we have two brains, not literally, we're not talking about left brain, right brain, but we're talking about two systems that we use for thought inside of our brains. Now, he outlined them as System 1 and System 2. I'm going to address System 2 first, because this is the one that most of us think of when we think about our brains. We think about that sort of logic processor. This is sort of what sets us apart from the animals. It is that sort of evolutionary part that resulted in the neocortex, if you remember that from biology class. So it is very good at being logical and deliberate and going step by step, if then else kind of scenarios. If you have a question to be answered, it can search out and find the right answer to that question. But one of the problems with that is it actually requires a lot of energy. If you're using System 2 brain processing, then you can be as exhausted after an hour's worth of mental activity as if you were riding on a bicycle, or a stationary bike, or doing some kind of exercises, because it uses the same kind of amount of energy in much the same way that our muscles would. And because of all of this, and that's all that's built into it, actually ends up being a very slow process. So there's two outcomes from this. One of them is that we don't use this system very often. So this thing that we sort of identify with as the logic processor, what our brains are really good to do, it turns out from Kahneman's research that we only use this about 5 to 10% of the time. And one of the reasons for that is, evolutionary-wise, it didn't operate fast enough for us to avoid getting eaten by predators. So we needed a different system for being able to process lots of loads of information, but be able to do it in a super fast way. And that was System 1. And System 1 is called pattern matching. So it's what allows us to look at these graphics over on the right and see the triangle in the top graphic and the sphere in the bottom graphic. It's the reason why these sort of illusions work. There's almost no energy required, and it puts together a bunch of the information based on what we see and gets us to a solution, to an answer that is that matches whatever we have figured out before. So say it another way, when we're younger, we're using a lot of System 2 to sort of learn these different patterns, understand the way the world works. It takes a lot of energy. It can be very sort of exhausting. But once we build these patterns, then the next time we encounter that, we pattern match. And if we've seen it before, then we want to deliver on that decision that has happened before. Now, you may notice up here that I wrote down this phrase that it answers the first questions matched. There's this very interesting phenomenon about System 1, which is that if somebody asks you a question, the first thing your brain does is match it to a question in your head that sounds similar, and then you actually deliver the answer to the question that's in your brain instead of the question that's actually being asked to you. And usually that is good enough. And we usually give an answer that matches, and so we don't even notice that this is happening. It's only when the answer that's given doesn't match the question that's asked that we slow down and say, wait, but I thought you were asking this. Oh, no, is that what you were asking? When we get to the real clarification, we kick in System 2, we start to understand what the question is that was actually asked, and we come up with the actual correct answer. So this is actually origins for a lot of problems and conflicts that may arise within teams. I'll often talk about this in that sort of realm of psychology and conflict resolution. But it also comes into play when we're building products, because our customers, our users are doing this same thing. When they look at a system, when they look at a feature, when they're deciding whether or not to buy, or whether or not to switch, or whether or not to sign up for a program, they are looking at the program, they're pattern matching it to a thing that they're familiar with in their brain, and if it matches, then they feel good about the decision, and if it doesn't match, then they're a little cautious about the decision, and they may spend some time looking into it and digging out more details, but most of the time that they won't. And actually most of the time is really kind of in that range of sort of 90 to 95% of the time. So this was why Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics, because he was able to show that people's decision-making process in using new software and making purchases and participating in commerce in general, 90% of the time is not based on logic. It's based on pattern matching. And so we have this sort of principle that we run through with all of my product teams, which is people are not logical. And we need to stop thinking about them in logical terms and sort of getting them to come on board and start using a feature because it makes sense. So it leaves us with the question of how do we talk to System 1 and how do we communicate with this? Now, if you've ever seen Simon Sinek's Start With Why talk, he gives one of the best encapsulations of this. Got the link up here, so you can go check it out later. We're not going to watch the video or go into detail on this, but I want to capture a couple of the highlights of this, which is that he highlights this idea of this sort of the golden circle, and the golden circle actually coordinates with sections in our brain. And so the why, the how, those sort of middle circles are our limbic brains, our sort of reptilian brains. They're all responsible for all of our emotions and reactions to things. And these are the parts of the brain that does pattern matching and does those selections. So and then the what section, the outer ring, is our neocortex, and it does all of the logic processing. So once we've done the logic processing, then we create a pattern, and from that point on, the pattern matching happens in a different portion of our brain than that which created that pattern in the first place. And it's really sort of weird to put it all together, but the main things you need to sort of drive and understand is that people will make those pattern matching decisions using a different part of the brain that actually has no connection to speech. So they actually have a real hard time describing why they're interested or why they want to make a decision. But the two things that we know are, one, it's because it matches a pattern of a way that they've done things before. And number two is it's tied to an emotional piece of their brain. So you will actually start to see an emotional reaction in their bodies when they have pattern matched. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be a wide range of things. But the emotion is one of those first triggers that lets us know that our customer or our potential customer or our citizen who is interacting with us actually is interested in the thing we're talking about and might actually take some action and participate in this project. So what I've developed with my teams is when we go out and we do customer research on our different products, and I give them an emotional ranking system. So when they go out and they talk about a new feature that they want to build, a new product that they want to build, we force them to go out and talk to folks and actually start talking about some of these things. We usually break it into two parts. The first one is what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and then later, what is our particular solution? But I have them look at the response that they get from customers as they talk about things. So the first level might be you're describing something and somebody responds in a very kind of polite way, oh, that's interesting, but they don't really engage with you. It may seem like they're interesting, they're nodding, they're listening, but if they don't actually respond back and talk back with you again about that topic, then they're not really interested and engaged. Now, level two is when you'll start to see people get engaged. And so if you ever talked about an idea and you'll see somebody that will ask you questions, well, have you thought about this? And what about that? And have you been around here? And if we did these in this situations, then how does your software handle this? And we often find those people who will debate us up and down and backwards and forwards. But when it comes down to actually putting down the money or making the decision or doing the sign up, they're like, well, I need a little bit more time to decide. Those are people who have engaged their neocortex. They've engaged that outer part of the brain, and they're using their system 2 logic processor to break things down, but they haven't quite hit the emotional side of it. And because they haven't hit the emotional side and they haven't hit the pattern matching side, the likelihood that they will actually make that change, it drops dramatically and is really reduced. So what I have my teams look for is the people who start to show an emotional reaction when they start interacting with you about your problem that you're talking about or the solution that you're presenting. And usually we'll see that show up in the head first, or maybe if they're gesturally based, we'll see that in their hands as well. And then you also, then if it gets really strong enough, then you'll start to see it in a full body reaction, where their whole body will become engaged. Sometimes we call this the jumping across the table reaction. Where people are like, you can really do that? If you can do that, oh my God, that'd be so fantastic. And that would really save me a whole lot of time. And so when they get that emotional engagement in what you're talking about, now you've got them hooked. Now you've got somebody who is actually interested, who actually cares. They've pattern matched. They may still ask you a bunch of intellectual questions about it, but by hitting them through the emotional center, you know that they're much more likely to take an action and to move forward on this. Now, those actions could fall into multiple different categories. There's a great acronym that comes from the theater, the acting world, MAD, SAD, GLAD, and AFRAD, as a way to remember the primary emotions. Is the problem that they're encountering making them mad and angry? Does your solution make them feel happy, glad? Do they seem to really just be dejected, with the plight of their daily work flow that they have to deal with? Each one of these things is a potential place where your product could come in and actually win somebody over by affecting their emotions. And what's interesting is it doesn't have to even be emotional in the direction that you're hoping to go. I tell a story of I was working with a team of people who were developing a mobile application for a voice teacher. So this voice teacher has this fantastic method, scientifically based. She can take anybody and within 20 or 30 minutes, just by giving them a couple exercises, drastically improve the quality of their voice. Now, she's gone about as far as she can with the number of people that she can see on a weekly basis, so she wanted to expand. And they were looking at creating a mobile application in order to make this happen, and they called me in to sort of advise them and help them to make this happen. So I took a team of people and I sent them out to the different places where musicians might be. And this one woman went to one of the music schools in Baltimore. And she said as she was talking with folks and talking about the problems that we had, identified, do you have trouble cracking on high notes? Do you ever walk out on the stage and you're not sure if you're actually going to be able to get to the end of a performance? Those sorts of questions. She said that she started getting these really emotions, reactions from people that they were actually physically it was like they were pushing her away and running it, literally running in the other direction, saying, no, I don't have the problem. No, that's not a problem for me at all. And so she came back and she was actually really kind of dejected about these research segments. And so, but I was rather inspired. I was like, okay, you actually got a level 4 full body emotion from a ton of people. So that's something that we can build on, but we just have to find out a little bit more information about it. We need to dig into the reasons why. So I was like, go back, find a couple of those people, maybe pull them off to the side and talk to them privately and see if you can dig down into some of the underlying reasons for why. And when she did that, the response that she got back from these folks was, all right, so I actually do have that problem, but you asked me in front of a room full of people. I can't let anybody know that I'm worried when I walk out on stage that I might not make it through the entire performance. If anybody knew that happened, I would not be hired again ever for any other production that I ever would audition for. And so we actually identified that there was a need for this work for the product, but we identified that one of the features they wanted to build in was this community, because one of the things they do inside of their sort of product team, inside of this music studio, is they have a really strong community and they share information and ideas back and forth. And they thought this would make perfect sense in an application. But what we found out through research is that nobody was going to share their details with anybody else that they didn't already know intimately. So nobody was going to use any social features for this application, which also meant that this application was not going to be able to tackle sort of viral, hit a viral component. So it wasn't going to really be shareable because people were going to keep this more as a secret for themselves. And so the level of referrals on this application was not very strong. So it allowed us to really focus on building just one portion of the application that had to do with the content and building a really good MVP for that, and really use it for people who are already part of the studio. But it allowed us to also figure out that the whole idea of the social sharing and community of side of stuff and building all kinds of integration with Facebook and Twitter or all these other things was just never going to be used. We got to know that ahead of time before we actually built anything. All right. So that is the reason why you see an E in front of eWSJF. And we call that emotional weighted shortest job first. But before we jump into what eWSJF looks like, I'm going to take another pause and see if anybody has questions on Kahneman or Cynic or any of those features of product research, customer research.
We did not. We did have an operational question, and yes, we'll be emailing out the slides and handouts after the fact. That's all.
All right. So let's talk about how this fits in. So what we've basically done is we've added an extra column in here, which is the emotional problem. And so for each of these features, we start with the same values that we had. And now I have my teams go in and say, all right, who did you talk to about this potential feature or the problem behind this feature to find out whether or not it's worth working on? And then what was the level of reaction that you got? And if they haven't talked to anybody, then I actually will put a 0 in this column, and we'll see that that actually is going to affect the score. I'm going to hop into a spreadsheet in just a moment and show you some playing with the numbers. But as you go through, and so in this sort of case, what they found emotionally was that profile management had no emotional reaction for everybody, like, oh, yeah, profiles, hey, whatever. But the thing that actually got the most emotional response when it came to bookstore design was actually the commenting. They got a lot of physical response from people saying, oh, yes, oh, when I use the commenting feature, that is really how I decide whether or not I'm going to buy the book. Because you're never going to get a chance to read the book, but people will go out and they will tell you what they've been through, what's frustrating, if it's an audio book, whether or not they liked the person who's doing the reading, all these things. And so we realized that a lot of people really make their book buying decisions based off of the comments. And then also there was some frustration where people were talking about, not having enough sorting options to really be able to get through stuff, and being pushed content on a book list, and they didn't want the list in the way that the bookstore publisher wanted it delivered. They wanted it delivered in their own way. So book list sorting was also something that really had an emotional response, but it wasn't as emotionally activating as commenting. And book browsing, they talked for a while about the different ways that they do book browsing, but they never really got emotional about it. So we gave that a level 2. And then if you look over on the other side, you'll see that that has now changed the scores. So I'm going to flip over to the previous version. And so our scores before were 9, 9, 10.5, and 5. And now our scores have switched over to 9, 15, 14.5, and 8. So it actually says that book list sorting was emotional enough and important enough to the business that that's something that we should tackle first. So our first MVP of our books should have some version to be able to sort the content so users have some control over it. Now, commenting, even though that was really important to people and had a really strong emotional impact, the business value was not so great, and so it was so it's still sort of sitting down there a little bit lower. But what we actually ended up doing after we came back is going back and adjusting our numbers and saying, all right, so now actually based on the emotional reaction that we got, and we found out that people were actually making their buying decisions off of the comments, now we think that commenting actually isn't a 1 when it comes to user business value. That commenting actually needs to get its score bumped up. So I'll go into the spreadsheet and we'll play with the numbers a little bit, and you'll see how that sort of affects things. And actually, let me do that right now. All right, so here is sort of a basic spreadsheet. I went ahead and hid the column for emotions. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this back out again. Come on. There we go. Hooray for software. Okay. Let me shorten this up a little bit so we can see the score at the end. Okay, so we can see now here's our original scores, and I'll show you the calculation over here. So it may be a little bit small to see, but what the Excel does is it actually takes columns B and C, and multiplies them together. And then it adds in time criticality and adds in risk reduction. So one thing we found is that emotional impact can really boost the business value score, but it doesn't really have an impact on time criticality or risk reduction, which is another way to say of sort of our operational risk. And then everything is divided by our G4 column. So again, as we walk through it, we've got B column times C column plus D column plus E column divided by G. It gives us our scores. So as soon as we come in here and we say the profile, commenting got a 4, now that's increased our thing to an 8. So now if we go in and we say, all right, so if they were really making purchasing decisions based off the comments, so maybe this really is a 5 in our value. And so if we move this from a 1 to a 5, and it's getting a level 4 emotional reaction, commenting is now the most important thing we should do, which means that we should take everything else that we're doing and create just a book list to click through with a simple page that lists comments, and spend most of our time in our feature building time on building out our comment section, rudimentary profile management. And then we can come back on second round of MVP and add additional book browsing details, and come back later and add additional book sorting. But actually we got our level 3 response, which pops that up to 15. So all right, so if we go by our numbers that we have, book list sorting is our second most important, and then book browsing is our third, and profile management is our last. So this is the sort of thing that you do in the conversations that you have within your executive team with your product managers. You sit down and you start sort of equating these things back and forth. What are the responses that we get? Now, likewise, if we took a feature out there and we said, oh, we really should have book list sorting. Great. Now say, did you talk to any customers about this? And they'll say no. And so I'll put a 0 in that column. And then you can see this drops down. Now what this does is this prompts my teams to go out and do the 2 things that they should be doing in order to increase their scores here. They either need to talk to more customers and get higher values. And so they'll come back and say either, oh, I talked to a bunch of customers, but nobody was really interested. And so it sits down in a 1. Or they'll say, I talked to a bunch of customers, and boy, they chased me around in circles, but nobody really got an emotional reaction. Or they'll say, I talked to people and I got a really strong emotional reaction, oh, wow, I know what you mean now about full body reactions. And as soon as we do that, then the numbers start popping up. And the other thing we look at is this job size. Since this is the denominator, we can really change the scores by getting things done faster. And so oftentimes what I'll do with teams is we will look at, I'll have them give sort of the overall score. So for example, they might say, it'll take us 3 sprints to do book list sorting. It's actually going to take us about 4 sprints to do book browsing and 2 sprints to do commenting. So now you can see that there's a selection of comments or scores over here that are a little bit different. Commenting is still kind of up there because it gets a strong reaction, but profile management comes in next. But we kind of look at these things and we're like, book list sorting, we got a strong reaction on this. Book browsing, we got a strong reaction. Or book browsing, we know has value. We need to be able to show all the details and the pricing so that people can purchase it. So could we do this faster? And so what I'll do is I'll actually have those business teams sit down here and play with the numbers and say, all right, so if we got this done in 3 sprints, how important is it? And if we got this done in 2 sprints, okay, now it's starting to get important. Likewise, if we took book list sorting and we got that done in 2 sprints, or if we got it done in 1 sprint, so now it's something to work on. So now we go into the teams and we say, all right, what could you build for me that's book list sorting in 1 sprint? Or what could you build for book browsing in 2 sprints? And it's a very different conversation. When you go in and just ask teams and say, how long is it going to take to do book browsing? They're going to give you an estimate for all the different possibilities because they know scoping is going to come into play. But if you go in and ask them and say, what level of book browsing could you give me within 2 sprints? Now their brains are going to be working in a very different way. Now they know they don't have to deliver everything, that they don't have to worry about really scope creep, that the whole goal is to deliver a browsing experience within 2 sprints, and they're making all their decisions based off of that. And so we can actually use these numbers in a couple of different ways to try to then design our MVPs based on how many sprints we can do. Now, that being said, if we go into our teams and say, hey, could you give me book list sorting in 1 sprint, what would that look like? Their first reaction is probably going to say, no, I don't think that's possible. I would encourage you to push them to walk away, do a little research, come back, and give them a more detailed analysis of what would it look like to get book list sorting in 1 sprint. And they'll probably give you something that maybe it doesn't look right, it's not going to work, it's not something that you want. And at that point, then ask them and say, all right, what's the absolute minimum that you could do? And then whatever number they give you is what you have to put in here. And this goes back to more traditional WSJF, which is reserves that job size column to answers given by the team, in the same way that we do estimating and planning poker. We want the people doing the work to give us the estimates of what the job size is. So you start with that idea of, I would love to have it in 1 because that's when it gives me value. And then you let them tell you if that's actually possible. And then you put in the smallest number possible here, and then you call that your MVP. And so we'll call this MVP book list sorting number 1. And still not super valuable at 2, so the only way it gets valuable is if it becomes a 1. And so then we would go through and make our decision and say, all right, so we're going to do, if we can get it done in 1 sprint, we're going to do book list sorting first, and then we're going to tackle commenting. If we can't get it done in 1 sprint, then we're going to start with commenting, then book details, followed by profile management, and do custom sorting last. All right, so that is emotional weighted shortest job first, and how that all works together in the spreadsheets. Any questions?
All right, a few questions here. If you have to drop off, thanks for joining us today. We'll stick around for a while to wrap up all these questions. So Pete, are all these values decided by the team?
Oftentimes these values are more decided by that value management office. So it's the product managers together with the executive level staff, sales folks, maybe, or marketing folks, with the exception of column G, the job size. The job size should be delivered by the team that is going to implement it. Sometimes we invite like the architects or the system architects to give us estimates, but then we always go back to the team for job size or number of sprints.
All right, and then who creates the spreadsheet? Is it the Scrum Master?
If you're since it's up at sort of that value management level, oftentimes it's more of if you're using like SAFe, that would be your release train engineer. If you're using like Scrum at Scale, then that might be your chief Scrum Master or your chief Scrum Master. So it's generally a level above the Scrum Master. Although I will say that I have one set of teams that is an API team. So they build an API that other folks interact with. And so they actually do this on the team level. And so the Scrum Masters will go in and post up values, and the product owners will score them, and the teams will give the size, or actually the architect will give a size, and then they'll debate which features to add to the API for their internal customers. But mostly you see this done at a level above the Scrum Master.
All right, and this one's more of a comment. I'll put a question mark at the end though. So it seems like the gathering of emotional response would need to be conducted in a consistent manner in order to be scientifically valid. The setting of the session, time of day, type of customer, and other factors could all influence the reaction, especially if the scores are captured in different sessions. Question mark, Pete?
That is very true. And I'll give you 2 answers. So one is that when we actually go out and do this research, we collect a bunch of different demographics about those folks, and we identify, how do we know that this person fits our demographic? We talk about the fact that a false positive and a false negative can actually have a bad impact on your data collection. So there's a lot more that certainly goes into this and designing a really great sort of research study, so that you make sure that you're looking at exact, really good target customers, target demographics, and that the scoring is appropriate. But I found that this level from 1, 2, 3, and 4, just by getting people in a room and like doing this together a couple times, when you send them out there, their scores between 1 to 4 are generally about the same, or we'll check each other when we come back. And if we see a 3 or a 4, then we'll say, oh, tell us about that experience. And and if it sounds like the person was really just more intellectual than emotional, then we'll ask that person to clarify. And so that's sort of like that first level of like really giving that accuracy for those teams who are really sort of solid, and really into sort of the scientific side of things. Now, answer letter B, number 2, is that even just winging it in many cases is giving us so much more information than we ever had before. Even just getting somebody out there to talk about emotions with somebody else, or come back and talk to us about the emotions that they see, generally gets us a lot closer to the output, even if we can't say that it is scientifically valid and entirely reproducible from a scientifically methodological kind of way. So I wouldn't I wouldn't say that people have to do this in a very rigorous scientific way in order to get the value out of it. But if that is a thing that you like to do, there are definitely ways that you can check your values and make sure that you're collecting info on the right demographics.
All right, another question on the emotional impact. It seems like the emotional problem resonance correlates with the other variables in WSJF, like user value and time criticality. By multiplying it with the user value score, are you normalizing that correlation?
I am normalizing it more towards user business value, and we kind of hold time criticality a little bit more towards the decision process of, should we do it now, or should we do it in 3 months, or should we do it in 6 months? And that should take a little bit of a less weighted decision than business value and emotional impact. And that's part of the reason why it's so critical to sort of think about the VMO and the value management instead of project management, because this isn't about putting different features through our teams, it's about putting different points of value through our teams. So we are giving a little bit more weight to the value in those calculations, but we also need to really know, is it important to do this right now because we're going to lose customers within a month, or our customers really aren't going anywhere. They either get the feature or they don't, and nobody's going to be leaving us. So whether we do it now or we do it in 6 months doesn't really make a difference. So we separate those two things out.
All right, we'll take a few more questions, and then any more questions, if you think of them through the day, just send to info@LitheSpeed.com and we'll get you an answer from Pete. So Pete, we would like to know what is in the scoring guidelines tab down below.
Oh, yes. Scoring guidelines. So this was a set of scoring parameters that I put together with one of the teams, and that I've now shared with a bunch of other teams. And so we're getting this more refined. But it sort of gives some idea about when you should give it a lower value versus when you should give it a higher value. Actually, let me zoom in a little bit further to make sure everybody can see this. So on your emotional scale, anything that, if you never talk to any customers, it gets a low value. If the interest is just theoretical, or there's not a lot of customers that would respond, then that would get a low emotional impact value. But if it is something that is has a lot of customers, or it's a really key account, so the weight of that one customer's response is larger, because they have a huge buying power, then you might want to give more weight to whatever their score is. So if their score is a 3 and a bunch of smaller customers was like a 2, then you might sort of equate it and boost the score up a little bit higher to fit those larger customers. Likewise, this team tried to capture it in terms of, so if we could generate revenue within $500,000 or more, we want to give this our top number. That's sort of what we're expecting to get out of new projects. If there's no impact on revenue generation or data content, then that's that. Time criticality had this thing, if the CEO might go to jail next month, that's really high. But if we could do it 2 years from now, then we don't care. And then here's that discussion about competitor risk and the number of sprints down here, sort of instructions on how to best score that column.
All right, and we'll be able to send out this template, right, Pete?
Yes.
Okay, so I will be sending this out a little bit later this afternoon. 2 more quick questions and we'll wrap up. How is budget associated to WSJF?
Budget is a different thing. And I'm trying to think about how much to really sort of get into. Anything that gets, we more sort of want to do budgeting based on the value stream at a higher level. So in other words, if I have the value stream being sort of a group of teams that could work on a product. And so I might say, I want to allocate this number of teams. I want to have 4 or 5 teams working together on the bookstore, and I want to have my other 3 teams working together on, on another feature. Let's say it's like a search engine, or Amazon or something like that. So then the value stream and your decision of budgets really comes down to, if you've got a lot of stuff that gets a really high score in that bookstore arena, then you might want to consider moving like one of the teams from the search engine team over to the bookstore, and maybe they have 6 teams that work on that. And so you sort of adjust the overall budget by adjusting the number of teams that are available to work on these features. Now, one of the recommendations that we find is that you shouldn't do that kind of adjustment of teams more often than like semi-annually, twice a year. Otherwise, it can be really disruptive if you were to do that on even a quarterly basis, and especially on a sprint basis, and moving teams around from sprint to sprint based upon changes in these numbers. It's just going to create havoc in your team. So I would not recommend that. But I would let these sort of things and say which features tend to be popping up to the top. So if we put search on the same spreadsheet with our bookstore, if bookstore keeps getting a lot of high numbers and search gets less, then come back later and decide if you want to, at the 6-month point, move some teams from one value stream to another.
All right, last one. What if WSJF takes more time than expectation?
Takes more time than expectation. I'm not entirely sure what that question means. If the person is still...
Maybe on the estimates of the job size, maybe if it takes longer.
Yeah, all right, so sure, in answer to that question, so for example, this gives us like a 10, or this one is like an 8. We still do the same thing, and so let's say like all of our numbers are really high up here. So we'd still go through and we'd say, all right, so if it's going to take us 10 sprints to do profile management, we're going to tackle more the book browsing first, and then we're going to tackle commenting, and then we're going to tackle book list sorting. So just go ahead and put those numbers in, whatever your team gives you. Then if you can have discussions about NVPs, then that's a great way to lower that number for the denominator. But just deal with the numbers that you have, because it's better to deal with the reality than to try to fudge these numbers and then end up being wrong and making the wrong decision about what to have your teams work on.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. If you do think of another question, send to info@LitheSpeed.com and we'll get an answer from Pete. We do hope you can join us for an upcoming event. We have our annual Lean plus Agile DC conference coming up May 15th in Herndon, Virginia. And Pete, thanks for the great presentation. We'll be sending out the recording later today along with the template and the slides. So any questions, send over to us at LitheSpeed, and have a great day. Happy holidays. Thanks, Pete.
Happy holidays. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us.